Hi, welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, I am going to start applying CSS to preloader component. Let us start applying the CSS. In last lecture, we wrote this HTML markup for preloader, and in this lecture, I am going to apply style to these divs. So we can start seeing the preloader for solo website. I am going to hide my head section. I am going to style.css file. As I have been saying before, we will write all of our custom CSS inside this style.css file. And now time has come to write some real CSS inside this style.css file. Okay, in this lecture we will focus to apply CSS to preloader. Before I write any CSS, let me resize my code editor, and I am going to hide my sidebar, and I am going to open this project in live preview mode. And for live preview mode, I am going to click on this live preview icon. Live preview is built-in feature of brackets code editor. So by this way we can see both code editor and browser window side by side, and we will see the live preview while making any changes. Okay, let us start applying CSS for preloader. I am going to add comment for preloader. I will copy this comment style and the comment for the preloader is just preloader. We are going to write all of CSS code for preloader under this comment. I am going to index.html file, and first let us have a look at HTML markup for preloader. As you see, there are two parts of preloader component. The first part is preloader div, or you can say the parent div. This parent div is created to cover this whole web page, and this second div, or you can say this child div, is created to show the animation effect on this web page. Let us first write CSS for this parent div. The ID value for this parent div is preloader. I am going to use this ID value to access this div element inside style.css to apply some CSS. I am going back to the style.css file. To access an element using an ID, you use # and then you write ID value. In this case, the ID value is preloader, and then opening and closing curly braces. So this is CSS selector part. By this way, you select an element using its ID and you apply CSS inside these curly braces. I have been teaching these basic CSS concepts in CSS section. If you would like, you can go back and rewatch these lectures. If you notice, when my cursor is on CSS selector, the element gets highlighted in live preview with blue borders. Okay, the objective here is to cover this whole web page screen using this preloader div. I am going to set the background color for this preloader div. I am going to write the CSS background color property. And for now, I am going to set it to red color. Later, I will change it to white color. The CSS background color property sets the background color for an element. Okay, now I just have this red bar. I want this red bar to cover this entire browser window. And here I am going to teach you a very important CSS technique. We are going to cover this whole web page using CSS Fixed Positioning. I am going to set the CSS Fixed Positioning for this preloader div. I am going to write the CSS position property, and the value for this CSS position property is fixed. Now you can see it has become a smaller bar. Next, I am going to set the top, right, bottom and left dimensions for this preloader div. I am going to set the top property, and the value for top property is 0. Now you can see it is moved to the top of the browser window. Next, I am going to set the bottom property, and the value for the bottom property is also 0. And now you see it covers the browser window vertically. And next step is to allow this preloader div to cover the whole page horizontally. And we can achieve that by setting left and right properties to 0. I'm going to set the left property to 0 and right property also to 0. And you see this preloaded div is now covering the entire browser window. This is one of the best CSS technique to cover the whole page, and the reason I choose CSS fixed positioning because an element with position fixed is positioned relative to the browser window, which means it always stays in the same place even if the page is scrolled. I have a particular lecture about CSS positioning in past CSS section. If you would like, you can rewatch that particular lecture for CSS positioning, where I have clearly explained the concept of CSS positioning. Okay, I'll move forward. One another CSS property I want to attach to this preloader div is Css Z Index Property. I'm going to add Css Z Index Property. And the value for this Css Z Index Property is 9999. The Css Z Index Property specifies the stack order of an element, and an element with greater stack order is always in front of an element with a lower stack order. I want this preloaded div to stay in front of the page before web page loads. Therefore, I am using Css Z Index Property and I have given it some greater value, which is 9999, which means it is going to stay at the top of all the elements on this page. Okay, we are done with the first part of the preloader component, and the second part is to show the preload animation in the middle of this web page. And for second part, we have created this status div. Let us start adding CSS to this status div. I am going back to the style.css and I'm going to select the status div with its ID. I'm going to write hash and the ID value is status, then opening and closing curly braces, and I'm going to write CSS inside these curly braces. Now the objective here is to display preloading animation, right? And for preload animation we have an animated image inside img folder. Let me show you. I'm going to browse the img folder, and inside the img folder I have preloader folder, and inside this folder I have this preloader.gif file. Basically this is GIF type image. Before I use this animated image, let me show you from where I got this preload animating image. Visit this URL loading.io. On this website you can find and customize loading icons. It has several loading icons. I have chosen this Facebook loading icon. You can customize it. You can set its color. Let me set the color of this loading icon to moon yellow color. And the hexacode value for moon yellow color is F4C613. And if you want to set the background color, you can set it from here. Once you are done with customization, you can generate the GIF version of this loading icon. And now it is going to generate the GIF version for this loading icon. And you can download it and you can easily use it in your web projects as an image. So this was how I got this loading GIF image. Okay, let us use this loading GIF image for our solo website. I am going back to the style.css. Okay, we have this status div and I'm going to add this loading image as background image for this status div. I'm going to write CSS background image property. And the value for this background image property is URL for that loading GIF image. Inside these parentheses, I am going to specify the URL for that loading GIF. And I'm going to set the URL, and the URL is /img. This means go one step back and find img folder, and inside img folder we have preloader folder. And inside this preloader folder we have preloader.gif file. Now we can see the preloader image, but it is repeating. Next, I am going to stop the repetition of this image, and for that I am going to use CSS background repeat property, and I am going to set the value for this CSS background repeat property to no repeat. And now we have single preload image. Next, we need to set the width and height for this preloader image. I am going to set the width, and the value for this width property is 70 pixels. And I'm going to set the height property, and the value for this height property is also 70 pixels. And now we can see the preloader image in its original size. Okay, next let me position this image in the middle of this web page. And for that I am going to use Css Absolute Positioning. I am going to write Css position property, and the value for this Css position property is absolute. An element with position absolute can be positioned anywhere we want inside its parent element. In this case, we can position this preloader image inside the body element of this web page. I have dedicated lecture for CSS positioning in CSS section. If you would like, you can go back and you can rewatch that particular lecture. Okay, now I am going to position this preloader image in the middle of this web page. And for that I am going to set the left and top dimensions. First I will set the left property, and the value for this left property is 50%. And it is going to move this preloader 50% from the left. Next I am going to set the top property, and the value for this top property is also 50%. And it is going to move this preloader 50% from the top. And now we have preloader GIF image in the middle of this web page. But if you notice, it is not exactly in the middle of this web page. We still need to make some variation. If you notice, we have set width and height properties for this preloader image, and the values for these properties are 70 pixels. Now if we divide 70 by 2, we get 35, which means we need to push this preloader image up and left with 35 pixels to make it properly vertically positioned, and we are going to do it using CSS negative margins. I am going to write CSS margin top property, and the value is negative 35 pixels, and it is going to push this preloader image top with 35 pixels. Next I am going to write CSS margin left property, and the value for this margin left property is negative 35 pixels, and it is going to push it left with 35 pixels. It is common trick for vertical positioning elements. Negative margins are valid in CSS, and understanding their behavior is mainly based on CSS box model. Now if we look it again, you will see it is exactly in the middle of this web page. Let me turn this red background into white background. I am going to turn this background color for this preloader div from red to white. And now we have this beautiful preloader for our solo website. I will go ahead and I'll save my style.css, and I'm going to close this preloader.gif file. Okay, in this lecture we applied CSS to this preloader, and in next lecture I'm going to use little bit of jQuery to hide this preloader once all the content of this web page is fully loaded. So I'll see you next class. Thanks.